Welcome to Mindfulness Alchemy for the Modern Soul, and thank you for being here with me today. I'm your host, Esther Vidic. And today's recording is another special one because it is an interview with Matt Kay. Now, Matt is a somatic psychotherapist and the co-creator of Embodied processing. He has worked in private practice for over 8 years now as a therapist, and he also worked in various drug and alcohol rehabs, supporting others on their recovery journey. Matt is a certified holistic counselor, addiction specialist, a certified AOD, alcohol and other drugs worker, and a hypnotherapist. But he also works with other modalities as well. His integrative approach brings together the wisdom of ancient spiritual traditions and teachings on the nature of consciousness, as well as the findings of modern neuroscience around trauma and the nervous system. Matt's teaching is intuitive, open-ended, and exploratory in nature, pointing his students towards a space of presence where their own wisdom and innate intelligence can bring about integration, healing, and insight. He's also very personable in his presentation and shares his story of past struggles and his vision, insight, and wisdom when it comes to healing from trauma and overcoming addiction. I've heard him present and talk about embodied processing and the importance of how we feel in our bodies and what it means, and why talk therapy is so tricky and it can do more harm than good. He believes that when we drop the compulsive habit of trying to fix ourselves and replace it with a growing capacity to meet ourselves exactly as we are, with presence, compassion, and unconditional acceptance, transformation occurs by itself. These are his words, not mine. But I can say this: meeting ourselves with compassion and unconditional acceptance is profoundly beautiful. And in my opinion, this is the journey of coming home to ourselves. Now, on his website, mattkay.com.au, you can book a one-on-one session with Matt, or you can request more information about other programs, courses, and support options that may suit you. And of course, you can find the courses he teaches with the Center for Healing. And with all that said, let's welcome Matt to the podcast. Hello, Matt, and welcome to the podcast. How are you today?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
Good, thank you. So let's dive in, shall we?
Sure.
And let's begin with the first thing I would like to talk to you about is belonging. So, in a previous recording, I talked about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And as a deficiency need, the third step of the pyramid, if you will, is the need of social belonging, meaning that we need companionship and friendship and family and community in our lives. And another recording I've done was our four selves and what they need. And belonging and connection is really an essential need of the emotional and the spiritual self. So, my first question to you is this: in your opinion and in your experience, just how important is belonging, that connection to our self, our physical self, our environment, our people, and maybe even to a higher power, God or universe or whatever we call it?
Yeah. It's like extremely important, in the way we develop, as babies, attachment, which is it's basically belonging, the need to attach and feel a part of and feel cared for, feel nurtured, feel supported, ideally to our mother and father or primary caregivers. It's a survival need. There was an experiment done with babies. It was after World War II, but they got a bunch of infants together and they gave them food, water, and all the essential nutrients that they needed to survive, but those infants were never held and never touched, and a lot of them actually died.
Oh,
You know?
goodness.
And so that need for touch, for belonging, to feel welcomed, we can frame it in a lot of different ways to belong. I always frame it as the need to attach.
Mm,
That's as much as a survival need as food and water. And it's interesting, we're all born into different environments, and sometimes our family dynamic is not ideal, and but we will still do whatever we can to attach to our caregivers. The need for belonging and the need for safety are almost the same thing as well.
mm,
When we feel like we belong, when we feel attached, when a baby comes out the womb, and you've got kids, but when a newborn baby just kind of grabs your hand, that's the first kind of moment of attachment. And it's really mammalian. It's, all mammals do it. It's like a monkey won't put its child down for the first 6 months. It's
mm,
just clinging to its back. You look at all other animals in the wild, and that secure attachment is always there, in those early parts of life. And without that, it sets us up with really shaky foundations. We can't actually survive with none of it, but with kind of just little bits of it, whether in environments where there's lots of neglect and stuff, our nervous system doesn't properly develop.
mm,
And in the Western world, we've been through long periods where it's kind of like, just put your child on a cold, sterile surface and leave them to cry. And, it's good for their lungs and teaches them to self-soothe. And if you're too nurturing, too caring, it's going to damage them. They won't become independent, etc. And, all of that is really poor science. It's way behind what we're learning with neuroscience and with the development of the vagus nerve and all of that sort of stuff, and the need for a child to co-regulate with their parents and the need to physically attach. And so when that happens, when we grow up with neglect, because it is a form of neglect, and a lot of the time it's unintentional by the parents, it's just the way we're conditioned. And often it's because parents are so stressed and the economy and trying to make money and like trying to pay the bills and the mortgage and blah 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 blah, that like cultivating the attachment with the child is really not a priority.
mm,
It doesn't get to be. Our culture doesn't support it. And so then that sense of a child, that sense within the infant becomes one of like, I don't belong, I'm not
mm,
safe. And as they kind of start to develop a self, that self kind of learns to reflect back on itself, and it's like, what's wrong with me? And this really goes all the way back, to tribal days, even before that, before we even evolved into humans. But you think about back in tribes, to be excommunicated from the tribe was considered a fate worse than death, because
oh,
you couldn't
yeah.
survive on your own. To be kicked out of the tribe, it's like the worst thing that could possibly happen. To be kicked
Mm,
out of the community, because the community itself is based on survival. And so when that's severed, or when that's ruptured, and without proper repair through our childhood, we adapt to survive. And we all do this in different ways. Even in really healthy childhoods, it still happens to some degree, where we kind of trade our authenticity for that feeling of attachment, to that feeling like we belong. For example, if a child, is really shamed and punished, not disciplined. Disciplined is to teach, but punished, say when they get angry. It's like, go to your room. You're not welcome in the community when you have anger. So
mm,
then they start to learn that anger itself is a threat to their attachment. They learn that anger itself is a threat to their survival, because that survival physiology, I need my community, I need that attachment, that feeling of belonging to survive. So then they start to create a dissonance and a repression strategy and disconnect from their anger. And then that has lifelong consequences, to when we won't experience our anger and repress it. And so then they start to develop personality adaptations, and so they're not actually their authentic self, but rather they're what they had to be to survive their environment. And this can be really, really subtle, and it's all based on that need to attach and that need to belong. So it is so fundamental in our development, in the way that we navigate life and learn to navigate life. It's completely core in who we become, or who we feel we become, the development of our identity. It's also completely core in the way our nervous system learns to regulate itself. If we don't feel like we belong, or if we feel like that sense of attachment is constantly threatened, then our nervous system learns to live in a state of fight or flight, always on edge, worrying where's the next rupture to my relationship going to come from. And so then it's kind of like always living with this brace, and people can live with this low level hum of anxiety, not even know what really it is, just this uncomfortable feeling of like something's wrong. Or it can go, full blown constant panic attacks, or their system can collapse into like depression and give up, like a kind of learned helplessness, because just that need for belonging gets ruptured so many times that their nervous system goes into, like a rat in a cat's mouth, like goes into a limp kind of giving up state. And so there's all different ways it can show up, but it's all based on those very early formative years. But in contrast to that, a child who grows up feeling like they belong, feeling like they're wanted, can attach to their parents, are cared for, supported, all of those sort of things that would happen in a healthy community. Like back in the day, we used, like, the village would raise a child. You trusted your neighbors, everyone kind of works together, and everyone's in community together, and you feel like you belong. So it's not just your mum and dad, but you belong to a wider network of people, a vaster community. So it's like holding environments. You're held within an environment that's held within a larger environment. And so that feeling of belonging really, is internalized growing up. So then in adult life, that feeling of belonging is there, and that feeling of self-worth is just natural. It's something that comes automatically with that kind of healthy environment. But it's harder these days because the threat, that's constantly being fed to us, around the world. It's like, watch the news. All it is about threats, and no one really trusts their neighbors anymore in the culture that we live in. Western culture, it's not something we have valued. It's kind of every man out for himself. No one kind of that sense of support is diminished, and we live in this quite contracted state, and so the feeling of belonging is more rare these days. And so, but I think it's a big cause of a lot of our world issues. Actually, it doesn't just come back to individuals and mental health and personal issues, but it comes to a lot of collective issues as well. If we because I talked about different holding environments, there's the collective holding environment. So, it's kind of like if like different countries at war, like they might feel like they somewhat belong to their country, but there's a larger holding environment that we all belong to, a larger community. It's called humanity. And, so if we don't feel like we belong to humanity, then we're more than happy to go to war and kill and bomb and all of that sort of stuff over it. But it's like, if that collective field, if we all felt like we belonged to that community, common unity, it's what community means. If we all felt like we belonged to that, we wouldn't be able to do the things that we do. So you can bring it all the way back to so many things. It's a big topic.
It is a big topic, and I think it's super important because, as you said, this is a core need, an essential need. And if it's not there, we can go as far out there, with the collective that you talked about, that honestly, if you watch the news and if you let that get to you, you see that we are divided, we are enemies, we have all these issues, and people are so desensitized to it by now, really,
Yeah.
that horrible things and horrible acts of violence are totally fine and cool. And kindness even within our community or in one-on-one relationships, it's almost frowned upon and frightening. Why are you kind to me? That's
Yeah,
one
it's
thing. Or
considered
if
like
you
felt
look
as
at,
like what are you manipulating me, or
yeah,
like there's something not
what's
trust.
your
You don't
agenda?
trust.
What's your agenda? Why are you so
Yeah,
nice? Yeah. And also, although I'm not a dating coach, but my take on the whole with the attachment and the belonging and that not being nurtured in childhood, often people go out in the world and start dating, and they are what I call the hungry shopper. You're
yeah,
so desperate for need and like that
yeah,
belonging, that you're more than happy just to anyone who looks at you nice and smiles at you and says something, you fall for it because you're so
yeah,
hungry and empty on the inside.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So,
Exactly. And a lot of the people like that, that it's the thing they long for the most, but the thing they're the most terrified of at the same time. So it's like having your foot on the accelerator and on the brake at the same time. No. And so we end up in relationships and relationship patterns that become cyclical, reenactments of our childhood. And a lot of it comes back to, for a lot of people, the fear of abandonment. If I feel like I belong, then that's threatening in itself. So people can be all, what we call disorganized and tangled up in different ways. So there can be this longing for belonging, and at the same time, absolute terror of it, because their experience when they have felt it, it's been taken away,
mm,
at a moment. And like I said, the rupture in that connection, and so then they live in this state of hypervigilance. It's the thing someone wants the most, but yet it's the thing that scares them. It's the most threatening, because they can be abandoned and it can be taken away at any time, and so that it's really common, in our culture, especially
and
especially
vicious cycle going around and around, and no wonder so many people literally drive themselves to madness with this, and nothing ever
yeah,
works because they can't get out of that cycle. So,
exactly, yeah,
yeah, let's pop to our next question, because now we can. It's a nice segue. Let's relate to the next one, which
sure.
is wounding events, and that's what we've been talking about. Like a wounding event happens, and that connection, that belonging is, let's say, severed. That we understand that we all have wounding events in our life. May it be rejection, abandonment, humiliation, betrayal, injustice. So the next question for you is this: in what way these unhealed and unloved and unresolved wounds in us, these aspects of ourselves, can lead to our own misery? As we said, it's a vicious cycle. How can we break out of that cycle, so these things are not a life sentence? It's not to rob us of joy. What can we do to be able to live full and empowered and connected lives?
Yeah. So the first step, it always brings me back to a quote by Carl Jung. It's until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you'll call it fate. And a lot of these things, they're happening autonomously, meaning they're happening unconsciously and automatically.
Mm,
It's like, I spent 15 years in addiction, and I remember one day I was sitting in rehab, and I just kind of woke up and I thought, how the did I get here? And I kind of had this realization, wow, it's like my whole life was on autopilot, just playing itself out, like I was asleep at the wheel. And, a lot of people's lives are like that. One of the first questions I often ask my clients who I work with is, how much of your life is done on autopilot? You know, how much of your life is just when you wake up to the end of the day, how much of that is on autopilot? And most of them will say probably 99% of it.
Yeah.
You know? And so the way we're conditioned is, it's like you learn to drive a car. You know, you got to consciously kind of learn to do it, but then you get in the car and you just drive, and everyone knows that experience. Like, you get in the car, you drive to work, and then you're like, whoa, how did I get here? I was just not present that whole drive. You just kind of come to when you get to work. It's just autonomous, you know, it does itself. And the same is with our wounds. You know, we reenact and replay our wounds. And, you know, a lot of stuff is really generational based as well. So, you know, our parents have played out these wounds and these styles of parentings and a relationship. Their parents have played that out. You can trace it back all the way, Adam and Eve, you know, who knows? But, you know, it's kind of like you can't really find a cause in that sense to blame, you know, and even if we did know where it started, it wouldn't necessarily help. But the way through, the way to transformation is to be able to actually begin to first make them conscious, you know, start to see, you know, like a lot of people, it's like they're not even aware that they have repressed anger or repressed terror or trauma from their childhood, or you know, personality traits that are based on survival rather than authenticity. It's like people were just living it, you know, like don't even know, you know. And so the first step is always just to start to make conscious, start to see, because you can't change what you're unaware of. You know, the unconscious is steering the ship in that way. And so when you start to allow yourself to look, you know, to start to see the different areas where you're being controlled, where your wounds and triggers and nervous system reactions are kind of controlling your life, where you don't actually have conscious choice, you know, free will's kind of out the window in that state, and start to really see it. And then it's a process of seeing it more and more deeply, beginning to understand it, see it for what it is. You know, it's like that those people longing for a relationship to the point where they kind of self-abandon, you know, they give themselves up, their authenticity, and have no boundaries, and then set themselves up for abuse and all of that sort of stuff. It's like, well, let's get curious about that. Like, what's it really about? And, you know, maybe they'll touch on unmet childhood needs that they didn't even know was there, wounds like shame, grief, you know, terror, whatever it is that people experience. You know, deep sense of helplessness that's held in the psyche that they just want someone to fix, you know. And when they start to become aware of those things, it puts the whole experience in a different context. You know? It's like, oh wow, you know, it's not the other person that I'm looking for. I'm just using them like a drug, you know, to try and fill the hole. And, you know, you could say that's a kind of love addiction. You know, it's like you're using someone else to fulfill a sense of deficiency within that you're not even conscious of. And so when you start to allow yourself to become conscious of these wounds, start to become aware of them, learn to actually stay present to them. You know, say there's a feeling of resistance in the belly, like a grip, you know, of resistance. Can we actually be present to that resistance? You know, say there's an uncomfortability or a sense of worthlessness about the self. If we feel that in our belly, and the instant reactions, oh, I need someone to soothe this, you know, I need a relationship, you know, and then you go into rumination and fantasizing and all of that sort of stuff, or you reach for your shot of heroin. Like, it doesn't matter. Essentially, it's the same thing, you know. Can we actually just begin to teach ourselves to turn back around towards, make that U-turn of attention, and give attention to that lost aspect of ourselves? That's what I mean by make it conscious, to begin to actually turn back around, make a U-turn of attention, and start to give presence, compassionate presence, to the part of ourselves that we had to abandon. You know? And this begins to a kind of unification process. We start to bring all the fragments of ourselves that we pushed unconscious and repressed back, and to integrate into a sense of wholeness. And this is, you know, something that we can might have to do for the rest of our lives. It's infinite. There's no end point where it's like I'm perfect. But and so then this way, we can still have wounds. It's okay to have wounds. It's like someone who's been in a car accident and has a bit of a limp. For some people, they went through significant trauma or neglect, but those wounds no longer control our lives when we have the capacity to be with them. We've regained conscious control. They're not unconsciously steering the ship. We're awake at the wheel rather than asleep at the wheel, in a sense. And so through that, comes this kind of transformation process. It's like maturation. We actually mature. A lot of people, it's like they're actually just 4 or 5, 4 or 5 years old emotionally, just reenacting that over and over. And so this is how we kind of start to come to emotional maturity and start to learn to have more self-compassion and empathy for ourselves, which then translates to empathy for others, compassion for others.
It's very interesting. I really love the way you put it, is that we need to make it conscious. I think it is very brave to make it conscious. I have there's a saying I really love, and I have no idea where I got it from, and I've got it ages ago, but that some goes along the lines that if you name your demons, they have no longer have power over you.
Yeah.
And in a way, that's how I see that. Let's face it. Let's face that demon. Let's name it. Let's give it a name, because from there on you can deal with it. That's exactly the same that you just said, just in different words.
Yeah, exactly. Making conscious, name it, see it. And it's like we can start to see these things as like just parts of ourselves that didn't get what they need. They got arrested in their development. Like people talk about the inner child. I'm not of the view that we've got some entity in us like that's a little child, but rather we carry imprints from our childhood, like the wounds that we carry from our childhood still live within us. I think that's what people mean when they say inner child, but then they can imagine like it's an actual child. It can be helpful to think of it that way, but and so it's like we can start to have compassion for these parts of ourselves. They're just like, how would you treat a child who's wounded, 3, 4-year-old, 5-year-old, how would you be with them? What's your instinctual kind of orientation? And it's one of like, it's okay, you're safe, I'm here for you. And so then we're building the kind of the frontal cortex, the adult self, to be able to stay in control. We're developing that inner relationship, this relationship to parts of ourselves. So we're not just stuck in like this child who wants its mum, or its dad, and then acting that out in our relationship.
It's that reminds me of the primitive reflexes. And that when you still have, like in a child's development, when they still have those primitive reflexes, that it kind of, you can't have that neurological development, you can't develop further until those primitive reflexes you work on, and then you can develop. So emotionally, in a way, that's, I assume that's something very, very similar to
Yeah, when it's like
be
you
able to
can't.
progress.
Yeah, and I call things like missing experiences, like for an infant, the need for touch is really important, the need to be touched, because infants can't cognitively communicate, it's kind of like, they can't have a conversation. You can't tell an infant, you're safe, it's okay, we're here, we're still here, but it's like, so that touch is really like the most primal form of communication in that sense. So it's like, soft, soothing touch. It's like when you pat an infant on the back, baby on the back, or stroke it, like that's a form of communication. And so the essential need is safety. It helps that you're safe. We all know that feeling of being held, like someone hugging us. It's like you see a little baby animal curled up in its mother's arms, and it's a form of communication between the mother's nervous system and the child's nervous system. And so, a lot of people didn't get that. A lot of people that I work with, and so that developmental need of touch and safety and attunement and presence, eye contact is another really big one. Feeling seen, if there's no eye contact, if you don't make eye contact with your child, it's like that feeling that people grow up with a core belief like I'm invisible, or I don't deserve to be seen, or if you're holding your baby and you're always like looking away, like you're uncomfortable with eye contact, and it's too much to look into a baby's eyes because they're so innocent, and it brings up your shame or whatever as a mother or a father. But then the baby, or if there's lots of pain in the parent's eyes, lots of repressed anger and stuff, the baby will look into your eyes and it'll get that urge to turn away, and like that can affect their posture for the rest of their life. And so I've regressed a little bit, but so those core needs, those developmental needs, we can actually start to meet those, through therapeutic relationships, through safe relationships, through conscious relationships, and through relationship to ourselves. And those places where we got arrested in our development can actually start to begin to flourish and flower. We can actually re-trigger that individuation process, that got stunted and stuck. That's kind of what I was getting at.
No, that's brilliant. I could talk to you forever. I'm just trying to keep an eye on the time for today. So let's get to the next one. I'm really loving all the stuff that you just said, obviously. But yeah. So let's talk about something important, and that would be survival mode. So my question to you would be, as a somatic psychotherapist, could you explain what happens to a person when they are not living, they are not connecting, they are not living their best life, they are not fulfilled, they don't feel safe, they are constantly in survival mode? What happens to a person when they are in that state?
Yeah, so it's like, imagine we're in a situation where a lion's running at us. The instant reaction would be to run, flight. That's the flight response.
Yep.
If that doesn't work, then the next reaction might be to fight, so that's the fight response. And then if that doesn't work, it probably wouldn't with a lion. The next response would be we'd go into a freeze at any period here, so we'd freeze. And this can happen in a split second. Lions running at us, can't run, can't fight, freeze. So all of that sympathetic energy gets locked in the nervous system. We call them interrupted fight or flight responses. And so that's a survival state. It's when our survival is threatened to the point our sympathetic nervous system turns on, and then we can get stuck in that. So I call survival, it's like the switch gets turned on and we go into threat mode, but it never turns back off. We get kind of stuck there. And, it's like people often just associate trauma with like mortal threat, and it is that, that's a form of trauma, acute shock trauma, or like things like war, rape, abuse, or all of that sort of stuff. But what they don't understand is our survival physiology is also super sensitive to childhood needs and environments and neglect and missing experience and all of that sort of stuff. It can turn our sympathetic branch of our nervous system on, and I'm trying to keep it quite simple because it can get super complex, the different branches of the nervous system, and how we can be in different states at the same time, etc. But so someone whose nervous system developed to orient around survival is someone whose personality is based on that, on threat, on surviving threat. And this doesn't have to be threat in our experience of like mortal threat, like a tiger running at us, although it can happen to some people after that, but people who are stuck in threat, it's often repeated experiences some form of threat, whether that's a threat to attachment, whether that's a threat to the need to belong, whether that's in infancy they never had a parent who could co-regulate them to bring them out of stress. So I look at it as kind of like we can suffer a big acute trauma, which can blow our nervous system into overwhelm, and we get stuck there. Then it can also be micro events, micro stresses, and when the stress doesn't get metabolized properly in the body, and it's like a balloon that fills up and up and up, and then boom, we live in a complete survival state. And that will be dependent on someone's development. In childhood, if we have a really nurturing home environment, our mother and father are regulated, they can regulate their emotions, they co-regulate with us like a baby monkey on its mother's back. The nervous system learns to metabolize stress, and that builds resilience in the nervous system. So those people are far less susceptible to getting stuck in trauma, even if they experience, a tiger running at them or lion or war or something like that, because their ability to come out of stress the foundations were set up early in life. For someone who doesn't have that, they're much more likely to be traumatized and get stuck in survival states. And so I look at it as like a jellyfish. A jellyfish kind of pulses in and out. So we contract into stress, and then we relax out of stress. And you look at everything in the universe, it's all pulsing, a flower opening, closing, the heartbeat, a wave cresting and then collapsing back into the ocean. Like everything's kind of got this pulse to it. And it's the same with our nervous system. Everything's kind of stress, relax, stress, relax. And so stress is healthy. But what happens when we're stuck in a survival state is we stress.
We stay contracted. Yeah,
we can't get out of it, and trust me, I know of personal experience, 26 years stuck in survival. Some people I've worked with a lot longer than that, and it just becomes normalized for a lot of people, and birth trauma as well. If we go through traumatic birth, which I did, breech birth, C-section, all of that, and the shock of that gets stuck in the nervous system as well. But a lot of these things, it can be very subtle. It doesn't have to have overt, very obvious symptoms. It kind of can be like having my air conditioner on, midway through the day, you don't even notice it's there. It's like, imagine an air conditioner that's been on your whole life. You would not know it's there. Developed it. It's become one with you in a sense. And it's only when someone turns the power off that you're like, oh,
what happened?
So it can be, survival states can really be like that, just so normalized. Like we don't even recognize them as survival states. And just back to our culture is so survival driven. It's like encouraged, glorified.
And many people are quite numb. What I observe is that is a numbness to it, because I'm not returning to a state of homeostasis. I'm not relaxed. I don't feel safe in my body. I just exist, and let's get this done and that done, and I'm always here and there and whatever. We are not present. And when we get present, and I've done a course but you were teaching as well, and it was talking when you guys were talking about that what happens when we don't feel safe in the body. We don't want to be alone. We don't want to be in silence. We always want something, because not having the air conditioner on, which we are used to, as you said, it becomes so scary. It's such a scary
exactly.
thing.
Yeah. Well, relaxing that second pulse of the jellyfish, like, of the nervous system is felt as threatening, because if we're relaxed, we're vulnerable. So a lot of people can have the beliefs, unconscious beliefs, that if I'm still, if I'm present, if I relax, I'm vulnerable. So then, and it can show up as like chronic pain, through the body, like bracing, like musculoskeletal tensions, all through the body, that constant feeling of of bracing for threat. It shows up mostly in relationship, whether that's intimate relationship with our kids, relationship with our parents, or all of that sort of stuff. And so then we live a life of brace, constantly bracing for the next threat. And we can be quite functional, like as well. It's like we can be so frozen and numbed out to the sound of the air conditioner, this low level hum, and then our life just becomes one of escape. It's like what we say is, all of men, this is a quote, I can't remember who said it, I always quote it, but all of man's problems stem from his inability to sit in a room with no distractions without going crazy. And it's that, because if we become still and present, if the waters start to quieten down and all the ways we distract ourselves from ourselves, we start to see all the used tires and skeletons and wounds and things that exist at the bottom of the lake, and we've never been taught or developed the capacity to be with them, so the instant reaction is to get away. It's why people can't sit or be with themselves. But then our life is just one big addiction. Everything we do to try to escape ourselves because of the uncomfortableness of being with ourselves is addiction. That's what addiction is. Craving and aversion. We have an aversion to the uncomfortability here, and so we seek relief. That's exactly what the heroin addict's doing, and it's exactly what the workaholic's doing. The person just scrolling all day, anything to get away from yourself. That's what addiction is, so the whole world's living out addiction in various degrees.
End of the day, get home, pop the telly on, slouch on the couch, being in complete dorsal vagal shutdown. I'm numb to the world. I'm numb to everybody. Let's scroll on my phone. And that's not recharge. That's not regenerating. That's not... And I talk about a fair bit as well in my other recordings, that just how important it is, that feeling, that coming home to ourselves and feeling safe in that space, but being present with ourselves. Basically.
Exactly. And it's fine to watch TV and go on social media and do all your normal things, but it's kind of like having a dual awareness, being present within ourselves, inhabiting ourselves whilst we're watching TV. It's like the issue is when we are completely absorbed in whatever it is, whether that's work, another person, a drug, whatever. And we've lost self-consciousness, in a sense. We've lost the ability to be present to ourselves. It's a form of dissociation. Dissociation just means like we've removed attention from part of ourselves. But, there's a way of watching telly where you're fully present and inhabiting you at the same time. It's
if that's your happy place, and then but that I'm okay. I'm okay. I don't need to escape. I'm not using this, that, or the other thing to escape that. Connection.
Exactly. And so it's like begs the question, what am I running from? If we're using these things to relax, to chill out, to get away, from ourselves, it's like, what are we running from? And that becomes the kind of thread of inquiry where we can start to look and make it conscious.
Quickly, that's an important one, because I wanted to ask you about that, is embodied processing. And would you be so kind, explain, because you are the co-founder of Embodied Processing, and that's what you do. And please tell us more about that.
Sure. Yeah. So EP, Embodied Processing, it's a modality created by myself and Ryan Hassan. We developed it together about probably 4 or 5 years ago. And I'm not sure how long it's been released for, about 3.5, 4 years or something like that. And it's a somatic modality. So myself and Ryan both have lots of lived experience with trauma and addiction. And so we really developed everything based on our own personal experience. And we were people who tried a whole bunch of stuff, learned a whole bunch of different modalities, studied trauma back to front. really looked at the ins and outs of it, started to understand how the nervous system works, how somatic work affects the nervous system, and all of that sort of stuff. And one of our biggest passions is developmental trauma. So
Mm-hmm.
understanding how identity is formed and understanding how identity is oriented around nervous system states, people's different self-images. And so embodied processing essentially is a kind of psychotherapeutic modality to work with trauma, developmental trauma, childhood wounds, nervous system states, and it helps someone really to reorient and reorganize their nervous system, and start to learn to do everything we've just essentially talked about. It's everything I've just talked about for 60 hours of theory and 40 hours of practice. So it's the same thing, everything I've said, but about 60 hours of it. And so, it's somatic really means to include the body.
Mm-hmm.
It means the body. So what we're talking about is the felt sense of our body. People might have a thought like, I'm not good enough. A lot of the traditional kind of mainstream approaches will work directly with that thought, whereas in embodied processing or somatically oriented modalities, it's like, where do you feel that in your body? If I ask a client, if you say the words, I'm not good enough, where do you feel that? And they might say, oh, I feel it like clench in the gut. My shoulders want to keel over. I can feel it in my heart. And what EP does is we help someone to actually stay present to that feeling. So we actually metabolize the wound rather than try and rearrange the thoughts about it. It's to actually start to metabolize and feel through the wound, to allow that wound to stay present to it. And it's interesting because if someone learns to do this, it transforms them, in a really embodied way. That feeling of I'm not good enough, they don't have to rearrange and convince themselves, I am good enough because of this and this and this and this and this, come up with all reasons to compensate for this feeling. But actually learning to stay present to it, to stay with it, it starts to kind of transform itself. And then they start to touch on more kind of deeper aspects of themselves that have essential worth, that are already worthy, that are beyond kind of good enough and not good enough. And so working in this way, it's really about developing that capacity of presence and self-attunement, becoming conscious and learning to be with ourselves. The whole practice is oriented, whole modality is oriented around learning to be able to sit in a room quietly with no distractions and be with myself. And there's various ways that we do that.
I had some experiences when I worked with the body, with my body, and doing exercises, certain exercises, for example, related to the hip, to release certain things, how we store it. And I had personally some very cathartic experiences.
Yeah.
And I felt that what I couldn't achieve in 5 years with mentally or intellectually trying to, intellectualize the problem, my brain knows. I know the facts. That's cool. And when I started to work with that, I went like, wow, in 5 days. And it never returned. So that cycle stopped. You know what I mean? And I'm not against talk therapy. I think talk therapy, let's say,
No,
has its place.
it
But I
does.
think, but my personal belief or my spiritual take on the whole thing, I am a soul inhabiting this body in this incarnation. Therefore, I need to take good care of the body. And by that, I don't just mean, like I drink enough water and I eat decent foods. I mean, I'm really focusing on like how this works as a whole together.
It's inhabiting the body, that's what I call it. And talk therapy, it can be great, but up to a certain point. And also it's like traditional talk therapy, it can, especially with trauma, it can kind of perpetuate that body mind split. So for people with trauma, the body can feel like a very threatening place, and so they bounce up into their mind A lot of people do that, live in a conceptual world, just in their mind, thinking, and that becomes reality, and it becomes a dissociation from the body, from the felt sense. And so talk therapy, it's got downfalls in that sense, because it can perpetuate that split. If someone's dissociated from their body, it's like trauma and our childhood lives in the nervous system. It can be like trying to heal my broken leg by talking to you about it. It doesn't actually do anything to the broken leg, but we're limited to coping strategies and perspectives on it. But because trauma lives in the body, that's where it has to be worked with. And like, it's one of those things that it's like, it's so experiential. Like, it's like what you just talked about. You had that direct experience of somatic work, and it's like when someone has a direct experience of it, they're like, I get exactly what you're talking about. I can teach it till the cows come home, but it's not it. It's kind of like, I can teach you everything to know about a strawberry, but until you eat a strawberry, you don't know what a strawberry is.
That's
Same thing.
To me, that was a breakthrough moment. That was a new concept, and I went like, all right, well, I'm a skeptic believer. Let's say I like to experience it. I can entertain a thought or an idea without accepting it to be the one and only truth, obviously. But I'm curious, and so I really wanted to ask you about that, because I know that this is your line of work, and because
Yeah.
I experienced it on myself, I know that how powerful that was. And it
Yeah.
really is, it helped me come home to myself, to feel safe in
Yeah.
myself, in my body. And that changed my life.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Well, it's like we're beings of wholeness, but we split ourselves into fragments, and the body becomes a fragment,
Mm,
especially with trauma. It's like another question I'll ask my clients a lot is, how often do you live in your body? And it's like, a lot of them say never. I never just feel my body. I'm always dissociated from it, thinking, attention having to go on to this thing, to that thing, and the next thing, blah, 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 always doing, compulsively. And when I'm not doing, I'm kind of just zoned out into something. It's like, we talked about watching TV. We can do that whilst inhabiting our body. It's like, if we're not inhabiting our body, we're not inhabiting life.
mm,
It's building that capacity, to be human, to fully be here. And sometimes it's uncomfortable, and sometimes it's painful. And what we do is we develop that capacity and resilience to remain in the human experience, because if we're not in our body, we're not in the present moment, and we're not in our human experience. We're off somewhere else, building castles in the sky in our mind, so to speak. And so it's really like, I look at EP as, it's not about fixing something that's broken within you, but rather about recognizing and returning to your natural state of wholeness, becoming present and embodied and authentic here in this world, in this experience. And so it's something that we refine and refine and refine with no kind of end goal, kind of like evolution. Evolution doesn't get to a point where it says everything's perfectly evolved. It's just a constant refinement process.
mm. And that's brilliant. And that takes us to our last question today, because we are hitting the top of the hour.
Yeah, all good.
And uh, what I'm going to do is this. I would like to give you 4 words that, in my opinion and in my experience, they are magic words. And these are words that I would use to describe a life well lived, a full, beautiful, wonderful life. And these words are embodied,
Mhm.
empowered, grounded, and connected.
Beautiful.
And the last question to you is that, if you would be so kind to share your take on these words as a person and also as a practitioner.
Yeah. So embodied, is really everything I was just talking about, inhabiting your body to fully be here in your experience. rather than dissociated from it. To live in the felt sense of your body, to be in your body. That's what embodied means, and that really means to own your humanity. So without that, it's kind of like we're not even really here. The second one was empowered, wasn't it?
How did we go? We went embodied, empowered. Yes, that was the second one.
Yeah. So, that gives a sense of empowerment. Empowerment really means, agency over my experience, my ability to say no, to have boundaries, to be authentic. If we're just living from a survival physiology, if we're living from, different adaptive personality traits, based on wounds and survival, then we're really disempowered. Like I talked about being asleep at the wheel. But to be conscious, and I think that was the third one, wasn't it? Conscious,
grounded,
and connected. That's right. Yeah. So to be conscious is, to be empowered is to be able to be conscious, to make empowered decisions, not just live out cyclical patterns on autopilot unconsciously. And grounded, for me, that takes on the quality of connectedness also, the last one. If I'm grounded in my body, if I'm embodied, grounded and empowered in my own presence, my own authenticity, then I have that ability to be connected, to the earth, to the environments, the holding environments. I have that ability to really be here. It's like, and now it's that sense of solidity. It's like a ground, that ability to have a ground, feel like there's a ground, an ability to feel supported and held at the same time. And all of those things put together gives the capacity for that final word. It was connection, wasn't it? Connected. All of those things create that sense of individuation that I can then connect from, that give us that capacity to be connected to everything else. Because if I internally, it's like if I'm a house divided against itself, if I'm fragmented with inner conflicts and disconnects and dissonances all through me and my nervous system, and I'm not in my body and I'm fragmented, how am I going to connect? What's my capacity for connection? It's going to be very limited, very limited, maybe little glimpses of it. But if the house is unified, embodied, grounded, then my capacity for connection then grows. So they all kind of entangle and intertwine with each other.
To me, it's a beautiful wholeness, really. These things, it's that, and I think that the aim is to be present, to be here, and to live full lives. We have to have all these aspects, I believe, as you just said. Then we can connect. And then those relationships where we connect, either to ourselves, to a higher power, or to anybody else, they become really genuine and safe because we are safe. And so...
Yeah. And, it's all of those things, they, to me, like you said, point to wholeness, but they don't at all point to perfection. I think perfection for the human being, expecting perfection on ourselves or others, is an act of cruelty, because we're inherently whole with our imperfections. So there's no way of getting things perfect, and so, but there is a possibility of experiencing wholeness, and including the fact that we make mistakes, we fuck up, we, get triggered, all of that sort of stuff. It can still happen, but it's included. There's not a feeling, it can get to a point where there's not that deep feeling of deficiency. There's something wrong with me.
I am perfect just the way I am. And but it really, that's absolutely right. There is no perfection, and there's no need to aim for it. As you said, it's very, very cruel. But yeah. So I really enjoy spending time with you. Thank you so much for popping on the podcast.
You're welcome.
I really hope that in the near future we might be able to do a round 2.
Sure. Yep.
And thank you again. And I'll talk to you very soon. Bye-bye.